Stefan Molyneux, representing the libertarian position, is in a little bit of a debate with Dr. Paul Craig Robert. And one argument for capitalism that libertarians are sure to adopt is the argument that capitalism ensures the efficient use of resources. Another argument they're going to make for capitalism is that capitalism maximizes social welfare. So let's think about this idea of social welfare as not hand me down, give me out so I don't do anything. It's if you don't have enough social welfare, you don't have a collection of individuals called America, because you have people really committing antisocial actions. When social welfare goes down, 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 you got riots. Nobody wants riots. Social welfare is a concern for all of us. The social welfare of all of us. There is no non-pee side to the pool, and there is no non-smoking side to the restaurant. We are in a restaurant that is made up of 50 states. And we're in a swimming pool that's the size of 50 states, and there's no non-pee side to that. There's no non-smoking side to that. Capitalism does not lead to the most efficient use of resources. And one argument that he makes to that point is that under the traditional capitalist model, when firms use resources inefficiently or illegally, that the market will punish them. But what we have found, especially since 2006, 2007 on through, is that those firms who were most outside of the boundaries of the rules were those firms that are still around. And so the capitalist free market mechanism did not purge those bad actors from the market as those free market principles would force you to believe. If you're going to adopt that free markets are running the show and that free markets are the best way to go, then you have to be able to say that when markets operate, bad actors cannot continue acting badly. Now, you can say that what we have now is not capitalism, but that's just quibbling over words. One side of the street, Main Street, is always in the sun, and the other side of Main Street is always in the shade. And so one side of the street is going to command a higher rent than the other side of the street. Because this is the case, the side of the street that can command the higher rent should be taxed a little bit more heavily than the other side of the street, because it is unfair, illogical, and stupid for one human being to benefit over and against another human being simply because the side of the street that they are on commands a higher rent because of the positioning of the sun. The positioning of the sun doesn't have anything to do with us. So you tax the side of the street that's got the higher rents because of the position of the sun a little bit higher. This is a great argument for progressive taxation. You're going to always, you might be hearing in this cycle about flat taxes. We need to put that down to death in terms of the idea of flat taxes, because it's just inherently unfair, and it just really places an extreme burden on the poor. These flat tax proposals, they always end up being the poor pay more. Wonderful point that he says there, we have to constrain all sources of power as best we can, and that the best way to constrain all sources of power is to have countervailing power interests. You need to think about those centers of power that have been running amok with no competition against those forces. Okay, let's talk about the cost of regulating something. Costs to regulate. Costs money to regulate. And if we have if government has a legitimate role to protect us from harm from individuals, groups of individuals, corporations, or foreign governments that would seek to do us harm, if government has a role in doing that, then government has a role in regulating. And if government has a role in regulating, then there is a cost associated with that regulation. And then Paul Craig Roberts points out that we need to look at the cost of not regulating, right? To call back to the Joe Rogan Peter Schiff interview, what's the cost of not regulating BP, the spill? So there is a cost of regulating BP, and there is a cost of not regulating BP. When BP was wanting to go out there to get that oil, BP was not talking about the cost of not regulating it. Our elected representatives in the government were not talking about the cost of not regulating it. The only thing you would ever hear a discussion of, or oftentimes with libertarians and right-wing thinking generally, you will not hear about the cost of not regulating something. You'll hear about the cost of regulating it. And they'll say, well, regulations just increase costs. Well, you know what happens? Joseph Stiglitz' work, he summarizes it by saying that his work is involved with the problems that arise with the presence of imperfect and asymmetric information. And there's always imperfect asymmetric information, right? And then he also states quite boldly that we need regulations because of externalities. Where Dr. Paul Craig Roberts says that the capitalism ensures the efficient use of resources and that capitalism maximizes social welfare. Bouncing off of that idea, Stiglitz says that banks have the responsibility of managing risk, allocating capital to its most efficient use, providing a payments mechanism, and to do so at low transaction costs. That's almost a direct quote. And it's a wonderful way of breaking down what we're asking banks to do. Every single currency system conceivable needs to have liquidity, confidence, and adjustment. And that comes to us, I think, from Gilpin. That's where I got it, Robert Gilpin. But every currency system that could possibly exist needs to have liquidity, adjustment, and confidence. And if any regime set of rules using pieces of paper or gold coins or big rocks like they do in some Polynesian countries, right? If that system of transferring value between citizens and people does not have liquidity, adjustment, and confidence conditions met, then it cannot be a currency. It will not be a good currency. It will not be a currency. No way to have a currency without liquidity, confidence, and adjustment. So also banks here for Stiglitz, what are we asking banks to do? And Stiglitz says we're asking them to do that. Manage risk, allocate capital to its most efficient use, provide a payments mechanism, and to do so at low transaction costs. And like earlier, where Dr. Paul Craig Roberts points out where capitalism had the opposite effect, Stiglitz points out that the banks had the opposite effect, that they created risk, that they misallocated capital, that they jeopardized the payments mechanism, and that they did it all at high costs. And that is almost a direct quote from Dr. Joseph Stiglitz as well, that banks did not manage risk, they created it. They did not allocate capital to its most efficient use, they misallocated capital. They did not provide a payments mechanism, they jeopardized the payments mechanism, and they didn't do all of this at low transaction costs. They did it all at high costs. Stiglitz points out that there were incentives for excessive risk-taking and short-sighted behavior. There are many reasons for this, not the least of which is the fact that it's just a bunch of little pieces of paper getting shuffled around, right? And like my notes for Roberts, I'm not going to throw these away because these are good notes. So you have the separation of, you have the problem of agency because you have an owner-operator. You have ownership is separated from control. Stiglitz points out that we need regulations because of externalities, and that's something in our current political debate that we need to keep aware of, is that we need regulations because individuals, groups of individuals, corporations, or foreign governments who seek to do us harm, right? And what's the harm they do? It's called an externality. And so when a group of individuals or an individual or a corporation is operating within this country and they're doing business with the citizens of this country, there may be some externalities involved. We may suffer some negative consequences for their behavior. And if we do, that's why we have to have regulations. So whenever you discuss having regulations, oftentimes the right wing will say we don't like regulations, regulations are terrible, regulations are expensive. But once again, we need regulations because externalities are a fact of life. And we need to look at the cost of not regulating. So anybody says, well, we don't need regulation, just stop and say, okay, well, the specific thing we're talking about, let's talk about what would happen if we did not regulate. Joseph Stiglitz points out, wonderful point, because everybody talks about Adam Smith and the invisible hand. And Stiglitz has the wonderful point. He says, well, you cannot see the invisible hand because it's not there. There is no invisible hand. And there's a lot to be said about the invisible hand, but oftentimes libertarians and people who believe that capitalism, unfettered capitalism, maximizes social welfare, and unfettered capitalism leads to the most efficient use of resources, those people will often appeal to an invisible hand, literally, and say, by everybody just pursuing their own self-interests, the social welfare will be maximized, and the most efficient use of resources will be achieved by people just individually going around and making individual decisions and seeking their own. But that picture ignores costs that may be incurred, externalities. And Joseph Stiglitz' work, when he says the invisible hand is not there, this is not a video about Joseph Stiglitz' work, but to summarize one point, there are 5 points that he has, I think, but to summarize, his one point is that if you have a risk that you cannot buy insurance against, then you do not have a free market. There are very, very restrictive conditions under which a free market can exist. And this is continuing on with his presentation, the restricted conditions under which free markets can claim to exist. If those conditions don't exist, you cannot have a free market. And those conditions not existing is what wants to be ignored by libertarians. They want to say, look, everything's there for us. All we have to do is just do it. It's like, no, to have free markets, you've got to have quite a few conditions met. And one of the conditions that must be met is you must be able to purchase insurance against every conceivable risk. If you cannot purchase insurance against every conceivable risk, then you cannot have a free market.